All right, so let's talk about the three elements of exposure because I'm not sure if you totally grasp this. And if you don't, it's going to negatively affect your images. So this week you would turn in an image with a slow shutter speed and a lot of depth of field. So a slow shutter speed and a small aperture. And I asked you to switch that. And I feel like I've asked that a couple of weeks in a row. And I know you're a fashion student, so I just want to make sure that you're fully understanding what I'm asking of you. So the three elements of exposure are your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. For all of these, you have options that are going to allow more light and options that are going to allow less light in. So a brighter exposure or a darker exposure. For aperture, when you have a wide open aperture, that's going to be a smaller number because it's a fraction. So say f1.4, you're going to have a shallow depth of field, and that's going to allow a lot of light in. As you close down your aperture, and I think your image was at f20, let's double check. Yeah, f20. So at f20, you're going to have less light in your image. It's going to be a darker image. But in your image, you also had a long shutter speed. So your shutter speed was 1/10 of a second. So right in here, this bright exposure. Now you could have a faster shutter speed and that would allow less light in, but it would freeze motion. If you did that, you need to create this balance between shutter speed and aperture to get enough light in your camera. So you would have to choose a shallower depth of field and a faster shutter speed. I'll talk about that more in a second. And then you also have your ISO. Your ISO is really high at 3200, and that's going to create that digital noise. That's here, brighter exposure, 3200. It's actually right there. And what we want is to try to shoot between 100 and 400. So we want to be out here on your ISO. Now, there's this little kind of game that you can play with, and this is through Canon. And what we want to do is I want you to play around with the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So for this image, if you brought your ISO down to 200, which is about where we want, you can see that the meter, this is just like if you're looking through your camera lens and you see the meter at the bottom, that would be a -2 exposure. It's underexposed by 2 stops. So to make up for that, you could add more light with your aperture, and that would get a good exposure. So we can see we're back at a good exposure. If we take this picture at 1/60th of a second, we can see that there's movement happening. We can't even see the propeller on the airplane there. It's moving so fast and we have a long exposure. So what if we wanted to freeze that motion? Then we'd need a faster shutter speed. But the other thing I want you to notice here is that we shot this at, sorry, I forget what it was. Oh, f4. And that's a shallow depth of field. So we only have this area in focus. The background is out of focus and the foreground is out of focus. Now let's adjust this. Let's say we want everything in the image in focus. We shoot it at a f22. Then we're going to need an even slower shutter speed. So let's take this picture. Again, there's so much movement happening here that we don't have we can't see the propeller, but we can see the jack in the box, is that what that's called, is in focus, and the pencils are in focus. Now let's try one more. Let's try with a really wide open aperture. So f2.8, if we go back to that other chart, you can see f2.8 would be like right in here, right? Shallow depth of field. Then our shutter speed could be faster at 1/125th of a second. If we want it even faster, we could bump up our ISO a little bit so our image sensor is a little more sensitive. And then we could shoot it at 1/180th of a second. Let's see if that's going to allow us to have a still. We can see more of the propeller. You can still see there's movement. You can see it's shallow depth of field, even more shallow than when we were at f4. So these are things I want you to play around with. You can play around with wanting motion, not wanting motion, different kinds of picture effects, but really all you need to do is this manual mode. We want you to be working in manual mode, not shutter priority or aperture priority, and just play with these settings so you better understand them.